Hi everybody, it's Miss Ryan here. Today we're going to talk about UVs. What are UVs, why and what you should think about when you make them, and actually how to do them. So here in this image in this scene in Maya, I have a couple of objects, some furniture, and I also have some lovely primitives here. And what we're going to do, we're going to use these to show you how to UV and what UVs are. So when we make a 3D model, what we're really making is a 2D image that has the imitation of 3D. Each one of these has all these vertices that tell the computer, hi, this is a thing in space, right? In between these are quads, make this look like something. And the computer's able to do it. For each one of these vertices, you're also making something called a UV or a UV coordinate. And what this allows us to do is actually cut this object up and make it flat, like a sewing pattern or a pelt. So think about your shirt. If you look on the seams of your shirt, you actually, have a line there. And that's because somebody cut that up to lie it flat and put your cool patterns on it and then sewed it back together to make it 3D. That's essentially what we're doing. Any of you who've ever worked in fabric know that it's impossible to print a pattern on something that's not lying flat. It warps it, wrinkles happen, it looks ugly. And that's why we do UVs. We don't want our textures to look ugly. We want to apply our textures in an even way that looks realistic. And creating UVs that don't warp texture is how we do that. Because UVs tell the computer how the texture wraps around the model. So when you make primitives, they come with default UVs. So if I clicked on this square and went to UV editor, it pulled up that menu because I actually have the UV editor open on another screen here. We see this image here. Now it looks like a wireframe, and we can tell this is a face, this is a face, this is a face. You get the idea. But it's not actually giving us any information. When you're in the UV editor, I want you to make sure that you always have shaded mode turned on. You can turn shaded mode on by going to View Shaded or toggling the number 5. So 4 will bring you back to wireframe, 5 will bring you to shaded. And what shaded does, it shows us whether or not we have what we call overlapping UVs. Blue, light Carolina blue or periwinkle means that there's no overlapping UVs. And that's what we want to get to. We want to lie this object flat so we can wrap textures around it. So if I were to put a texture on this square, I got nice UVs. They're Carolina blue. It would work. When we're thinking about UVs, there's a couple of rules that we want to keep in mind. We want to lay the object flat, like a pelt or sewing pattern. We want to make sure our OVs are not overlapping. So light Carolina blue is what you're going for. Dark blue to magenta means that they're overlapping. That's why shaded mode is so important. It can be really difficult to tell things are overlapping in wireframe mode. You want to use the most efficient amount of shells possible, and we'll talk about what shells are in a moment. And you want to use as much of this UV square 1001, this guy right here with the green and red lines, as possible. And you can see there's only one UV shell, which is this thing that's connected here. If I right click and go to UV shell mode and click it, you see I can select it, I can move it around. It's nice, it's big, and there's only one of them. Having multiple UV shells by no means bad. In fact, you should. It's how you can use polyfill masks in Substance Painter. But having the least amount that you need is desirable. You can also tell that the seams, there's not a lot of them, and they're in places where it would be difficult to see. So just like your t-shirt, they put the seams for that under the arms because no one's going to look under your arms unless if they are weird. You want to put seams where they're not going to be seen. So you can actually see what's going on with UVs both in the viewport and in the UV editor. So if you look at the UV editor, you can tell I have these bold white lines. If you look at the UV viewport, it's also Carolina blue, and we can see those bold white lines. These tell us that cuts were made here. So if we were sewing, this is where seams would be made. And we can tell the non-bolded edge loops are where it's still held together, and that allows us to have just one UV shell. If I cut it up more, then I would get more UV shells. Let me show you a primitive that has more than one UV shell. I'm going to click on the cylinder. So the cylinder has 3 different UV shells. 1, 2, 3. If I right click and go into UV shell mode by right clicking, dragging while I'm still holding down right click over to UV shell mode, y'all should know how to change modes, but it's always nice to have a reminder. I have 1 shell, 2 shell, 3 shell. These 2 are the tops and bottoms of the cylinder, while this is the area that wraps around. And so if we look at the cylinder itself, we can see, sorry, Maya's being a little slow, that I have a cut down the middle. Ideally this would be in the back where someone wouldn't see it, around the top and around the bottom. The nice thing about looking at these 2 primitives is these actually can tell us everything we need to know about making good UVs. We can cut them like a square, cut them like a cylinder, and we can take more complicated models like this table over here and cut it up into different parts to figure out how we would unfold them, just like this cube and just like this cylinder. Different objects are going to be UV different ways. Let's take a look at the gear, which also comes with its own default UVs because it is a primitive. The orange here means that the UVs are reversed. That's usually not desirable, and usually you don't want to stick with default UVs because you're going to be changing things up. But it's okay in this instance because it's still going to end up flat, and this is a flat surface. We can tell the other 2 faces of the gear have their own UV shells. And one thing I want you to note is that UVs, when they make sense, they still resemble the object in some way. They don't look like a bunch of random shapes. I can tell that these are the top and bottom of the gear. And because I know this is an unfolded square, I can tell that this is probably something that would wrap around. It's very similar to the way that my cylinder was UV'd. So you can take these understanding of primitive UVs and apply them to actual objects. Let's talk about why UVing is important just for another moment before we actually get to doing it. I'm going to click on this cylinder. So with this cylinder, I know I have good UVs, and I can actually click this little checkered board in my UV editor to see how, if I had a texture, it would be applied. So there's actually some problems with these UVs. Do you see it? If we zoom in here, pan over, we can see that there is some stretching in our UV shells. That is not desirable. If we click on the square, we can see that there's no warping in the texture because all the squares of the checkered pattern are accurate. They're proportional. They're not stretched out. Also, you can UV multiple different objects together. Watch what happens when I paint click on the cylinder and shift click on the cube. If you look at it, you can see both UVs are in my UV square now. So if I wanted to UV these together, I could. Now that we have a basic understanding of what the UV editor is and why UVs are important, let's actually UV an object.